I appreciate so much your presence here today, and I am so grateful for these men who have led us in our various aspects of worship this morning. For Mitch's leading our singing, Jim in our prayer, and James Wells as we've communed around the table this morning. I appreciate Steve Jones, one of our elders, for sharing with us all of those family matters. And I couldn't help but to think, as Steve was reading through those announcements, how it seems that even though things are still very uncertain, people are doing their best to try to cope and get back to some degree of normalcy, whatever that might look like. And so we want to be mindful of that. I want to remind you that we are still planning to resume a limited Bible class schedule on October 4th. And that will involve a program in the annex for the smaller children, an adult Bible class in the auditorium, and classes for junior and senior high and college age, but all of those done in such a way that the social distancing can be observed and we can do so in as safe a manner as possible. So that's coming up in just about 3 weeks. This morning, I want to ask you a question. What do people say about Jesus? Some people say that Jesus is merely a myth, embellished by centuries of religious tradition. Some people recognize the historical Jesus, but claim that he is only a philosopher or a moralist, much like other great philosophers and moral teachers throughout the centuries. Some would say that Jesus is a religious leader, but not more significant than those who have led other religious movements throughout time. What do you say about Jesus? In our politically correct, pluralistic culture today, we are told that it really doesn't matter what you believe. After all, we're all going to the same place. We're just taking different paths to get there. Have you ever heard that? And to suggest that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one comes to the Father but by him, in many sections of our culture today, would be considered rude, arrogant, insensitive, intolerant, and even bigoted. Jesus once asked his disciples, "Who do men say that I am?" He immediately received 3 answers. Some of them said, "People say you're John the Baptist who had recently been beheaded." Some were saying you are Elijah, one of the great prophets of the Old Testament. Some were saying you are a prophet. But then Jesus directed the question directly to his disciples. You can read this in Matthew 16, beginning in verse 13, when he said, "Who do you say that I am?" And that's the question I want us to consider this morning. Who do you say Jesus is? What did Jesus say about himself? I want to give you 5 answers to that question this morning. You know, we're talking this semester about what does Jesus say? But there's a deeper issue. Because if there is nothing significant or unique about Jesus, it really doesn't make any difference what he said. If there's nothing unique and significant about Jesus, It really doesn't matter whether we give him our lives or not. So what did Jesus say about himself? First of all, Jesus said he was Messiah. Messiah. I want you to just let that word sink deeply into your consciousness. Messiah. Messiah. I don't know if it's even possible for you and I today to understand completely all that word means. For a Jew of the first century, Messiah was the embodiment of all things Jewish. The Messiah was the promised descendant of David who would come in military might and great political power to restore the kingdom of Israel to the wealth, power, and prominence it had enjoyed in the days of King David and King Solomon. Messiah was the one who would bring about military conquest over the hated Romans. The one who would restore economic prosperity to all the land. And the one through whom a spiritual renewal would be ignited. Now, what did Jesus say? What did he say about himself being Messiah? Well, first of all, you need to understand that the Old Testament prophets had boldly declared that the Messiah would come. Go back and look. I just want to give you two or three of these. Go back and look at Jeremiah 23, verses 5 and 6. The day is coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up from David a righteous branch. And the word branch is capitalized. I will raise up from David a righteous branch. And I will give him a kingdom in which he will reign. He will rule with justice and righteousness. And Judah will be saved, and Israel will dwell securely. And his name shall be called the Lord our righteousness. Now notice what Isaiah said. In Isaiah 11, verse 1, Isaiah said, a shoot shall come forth from the, or a shoot shall come forth from the sprout of Jesse. Who was Jesse? David's father. A shoot shall come forth from the sprout of Jesse. A branch from its root will bear fruit, and my spirit will be upon him. You see, the Old Testament prophets left no doubt that a Messiah was coming. And so when Jesus is born, and in his years of ministry, he never, ever refused to bear that name, Messiah. One of my favorite passages in this regard, well, let's just go back to Matthew 16 for just a moment. When Jesus asked his disciples, who do men say that you are? And they said, well, John the Baptist, Elijah, one of the prophets. And he said, who do you say that I am? You remember it was Peter who spoke up and said, you are the Christ, the anointed one, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus didn't say, wait a minute, Peter, you're getting ahead of yourself. No, Jesus said, blessed are you, Peter, Simon, son of Jonah. For flesh and blood hasn't revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven has revealed this to you. And then in John 4, I love this. John 4 verses 25 and 26, Jesus had been carrying on a conversation with a woman at Jacob's well in Samaria. And as that conversation begins to conclude, she makes this statement. She says, I know the Messiah is coming. And when he comes, he will show us all things. Then in verse 25, Jesus says, I who speak to you am he. Jesus boldly asserted he was the Messiah. And those who were around Jesus did not hesitate to recognize him as the Messiah. Matthew chapter 1 verse 17, in the genealogy of Jesus, in that opening chapter of the Gospels, Matthew says Jacob begat Joseph. Joseph was the husband of Mary, from whom came Jesus, the Messiah. John 1 verse 41, when Andrew and John had been following Jesus for a short period of time as he first emerges on the scene in his ministry, Andrew runs back to his brother Peter, and what does he say? He says, we have found the Messiah. Messiah. And so Jesus never hesitated to claim this term, Messiah, for himself. But not only did Jesus say he was Messiah, secondly, Jesus said he was the Son of God. Not just a Son of God, but the Son of God from his earliest years. In Luke 2, verse 49, you remember the story, I'm sure, where Jesus, as a child, had been left behind in Jerusalem, unbeknownst to his parents, who thought that he was with friends as they were traveling back to Nazareth. And when they returned to Jerusalem and found Jesus in the temple, and Mary, in her motherly fashion, said, son, why have you troubled us so? Isn't that just like a mother? Jesus said, do you not know I must be about my Father's business? Now, it's one thing to say that in the presence of your family, but Jesus was willing to make this claim in the presence of his enemies as well. Go to John chapter 5 and verse 18, where the Jews were seeking to stone Jesus. And there John says they sought to stone him not on the basis of the good works that he did, but because he claimed that God was his Father, thus making himself equal with God. And one of the most poignant parables that Jesus ever told is in Matthew 21, verses 33 through 41, where he told the story of a landowner who had rented out his property to tenants who were vine growers, growing a vineyard. And when the landowner sent his servants to collect his rent, the tenants beat one of the servants, stoned another, and killed a third. The landowner sent more servants, and again the tenants abused them, persecuted them, beat them. And then Jesus said, the landowner said to himself, I will send my son, surely they will respect him. But when the son appeared, the tenants said to themselves, this one is the heir, let us kill him, so that the land may be ours. There was no mistaking what Jesus meant in that parable. God was the landowner. Israel was the tenants, the vine growers. And Jesus was that son who would be rejected, despised by men in fulfillment to Isaiah's prophecy in Isaiah 53. Jesus unabashedly claimed to be the Son of God. But go, if you will, to John chapter 19, verse 27. When Jesus was crucified, do you remember the sign that was put above his body on the cross? It read, King of the Jews. The Jewish leaders said, it should say that he said he was the King of the Jews. But Pilate said, no, what I have written, I have written. There was something so special and unique about Jesus. Messiah, Son of God. Third, Jesus referred to himself as Son of Man. And this was the most frequently used term Jesus used of himself 80 times throughout the Gospels. He referred to himself as Son of Man. For a long time I thought, Son of Man, what is he really saying about himself? Is this just a designation of Jesus' humility, referring to his own humanity, referring to his fleshly body, his fleshly nature? Not at all. Not at all. For a Jewish audience, the term Son of Man has enormous messianic implications. And I would refer you back to the book of Daniel, chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, where Daniel has a vision in which he says he saw one like the Son of Man who came before the Ancient of Days, God, the Father. And he was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom so that men of every nation and every language might serve him. And it would be a dominion that would never, ever pass away, and a kingdom that would never be destroyed. Folks, that is huge. That is huge. Son of Man. And when Jesus was put on trial before Caiaphas, the high priest, over in Matthew 26, verse 63, Caiaphas said, I adjure you, tell us, are you the Son of God? And Jesus said, it is as you have said, and you will see, notice this, the Son of Man coming in clouds, sitting at the right hand of power. Folks, that was huge. That's what Jesus said about himself. Fourth, Jesus said he had all authority. After his death, burial, and resurrection, in Matthew's account of what we call the Great Commission, Matthew 28, beginning in verse 18, Jesus began by saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. It's amazing how Jesus demonstrated authority in so many ways, and yet he maintained such a spirit of humility in his life. But Jesus demonstrated authority over sin. Over in Mark chapter 2, when a paralytic, a man who was paralyzed, had been brought by his friends to see Jesus, and they couldn't get into the house where Jesus was, so they went up on the roof, dug down through the roof. I mean, instant skylight. How would you like that? And then they lowered this man down in the presence of Jesus, and he said, whoa, not even seen such great faith in all of Israel. Son, your sins are forgiven. Rise up, take your bed, and walk. And the religious leaders started saying, wait a minute. Who can forgive sins except God? They didn't know who they were dealing with, did they? And he said, just to show you that I know what I'm talking about, rise, take up your bed, and go. And the man got up and walked out. He had authority to forgive sin. Not only that, he had authority over nature. Go to Matthew chapter 8 to a familiar story where the disciples, along with Jesus, were in a boat on the Sea of Galilee. And during the night, a ferocious storm arose, and the disciples became afraid. And they said, Lord, don't you care that we're about to perish? And he got up and he rebuked the waves and said, peace, be still. And there was calm. And the disciples looked at each other, their jaws dropping, saying, what kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. It's no wonder that Paul would write in Colossians 1, beginning in verse 15, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of creation. For by him all things were created, things in heaven and things on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones, dominions, powers, or authorities. All things have been created by him and through him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Authority. That's what Jesus said about himself. All authority in heaven and on earth. We don't like to acknowledge that. We want to think we're the authority. We like to think we're going to call the shots. I'm in charge of my life. I'll do what I want to do. For a little while, maybe. He's the one with the real authority. And then number 5, Jesus said he was the way. There are 7 statements in the Gospel of John. We call them the I am statements of John. And in each one of them, Jesus uses a metaphor to describe something about his nature. He says, for instance, in John 6:36, I am the bread of life. Or later in John 8, verse 12, I am the light of the world. John 10, verse 9, I am the door to the sheep. John 10, verse 11, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep. They know me. John 14, verse 6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but through me. John 11, verse 25, I am the resurrection and the life. John 15, verse 1, I am the true vine. Now, if you hear someone making all of these claims, you need to take note of that. You need to investigate that to know who you're talking about. I heard about this professor who was a professor of ornithology. Is that right? The study of birds. You know what I'm talking about. For his final exam, the only thing on his final exam, you students can appreciate this, were pictures of birds' legs. All these birds' legs, page after page. And he said, identify the bird by its legs. Can you imagine that? One student was so enraged, he went up to the professor and he said, sir, I want to tell you, I'm senior in college, taking a lot of tests. This is the most foolish test I have ever taken in my life. The professor was enraged. He said, Young man, just for that insubordination, I am going to give you a 0. What is your name? The student stepped around, raised his pants leg, and said, "You tell me." Well, let me ask you something. When you read all of these characteristics of Jesus, and these aren't things that were said about him, these are things that were said by him. What's your conclusion? What do you conclude? What do you say? There are 2 books that every Christian should have. The first, of course, is the Bible. You expect the preacher to say that. But the second book that I really believe every Christian should have, especially every young person, is Josh McDowell's book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. It's been out for probably 50 years, been revised on several occasions, but every Christian in this day and age ought to have a copy of Josh McDowell's book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And in that book, McDowell makes this assertion: based upon the things Jesus said about himself, there are only 3 possible conclusions. Number 1, he was either a liar. He was a flat-out, bold-faced liar, trying to mislead people on purpose. And how dare anybody say, well, he's a good moral teacher, but he's not the Son of God. You don't even know what Jesus said about himself. He's either a liar or a lunatic who was mentally deranged and didn't know what he was doing. Or he is Lord. Lord. I choose to believe with all of my heart the third option. He is Lord. Now, my friend, this morning I've sought to ask the question, what does Jesus say about himself? But now I want to ask you, what do you say about Jesus? Because that's the question you have to answer. And may I challenge you to investigate the evidence. May I challenge you to look at it with reason. May I challenge you to look at it with a mind that seeks to know and not merely to prove a preconceived idea. And I am convinced that when you look at what Jesus says about himself, you will come away as Thomas did after Jesus had shown Thomas his hands with the nail piercings and his side with the imprint or the piercing of the spear. I believe you will come away saying, my Lord and my God. This morning, if you are ready to respond to him in faith, repentance, baptism, obedience, come while we stand and sing.